Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. It's Dr. Maish here with another live episode of the Black Mind Garden. And, today, I think I shared with you all last week that this month, along with all of the other observances, is Emotional Intelligence Awareness Month. Who knew there was such a thing? And as you all know, if you follow me, if you keep up with my social media, if you listen to the podcast, audio podcasts, and if you read any of the blog articles, this is an area of passion for me. And emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and of course, trauma informed communication. And so I've been thinking about this topic of emotions, and the question came to me: why are we so afraid of emotions? And for the most part, what I see is that people get afraid of negative emotions, the experience of negative emotions. And sometimes, in my experience, what I have seen is that people are also intimidated or afraid sometimes of too much positive emotion. And so it's led me to this question of, well, why? And I am a why person. Anyone who knows me well knows that I am a why person. I want to know what is underneath the this fear, this move against emotions, and particularly, in organizational spaces, and academic spaces, emotion is often suppressed, it's ignored, it's invalidated, it's devalued, and it's even feared, inappropriately feared, I might add. So I want to talk a little bit about, and this is, if there's the experience of emotions in ourselves, and then there's the experience of emotions in other people. And both can be oftentimes all of these things: suppressed, repressed, ignored, invalidated, devalued, and feared. So we'll talk a little bit about um, that happening in ourselves versus in another person. So let's talk a little bit about the why, because I'm all about the why. And of course, excuse me. And of course, there are whole trainings that I've done around emotional intelligence and emotions, and how emotion can be a an amazing tool and guidance system for us in our lives if we were to listen to it. The bottom line is this: emotions are a normal, natural process, and learning to listen to them from a particular lens can really make them a valuable guidance tool. So, why are we so afraid of emotions, particularly negative emotions? Um, so, first, suppression of emotion can be a trauma response. That is probably one of the more obvious things that I'll say today. Is it can be a trauma response. And so when a person, so let's we could talk about whole groups of people. For some, historically, the suppression of emotion was necessary for survival. Now that can be at the level of group, and that can also be at the level of individual. When you're in a household, when you're in a community, and there is constant um, oppression and violence, as my auntie used to say, we didn't have time for emotion, right? So that's the running thing. You don't have who has time for emotion. We're trying to survive, and so it's suppressed. And then the other piece of that is, in, when emotion historically had been um, expressed, then it is seen as weakness. And that invites a whole other set of responses, reactions, or interactions that once again can be construed as a threat to, or have actually led to a threat to survival. And so when we look at historically, or whether historically personally or historically in uh, in time, in the sense of time, why emotion has been suppressed, and especially in particular communities like in communities of African descent, this is a survival mechanism. This is a trauma response. And so that gets passed down from generation to generation to generation, uh, both epigenetically and culturally speaking. I know growing up in my household, I was trained into that, uh, and not necessarily verbally, but non-verbally, that emotion is bad, or having any emotion outside of positive, happy emotion was bad. That crying looked weak. Like, these are all of the types of things that, uh, when you come from a background of trauma, that can happen. Okay, and so that's just one of the ways it can be a trauma response. Individually speaking, if you grew up in a household where the expression of any emotion other than joy or happiness or contentment or calmness, even use of words like hysterical or too emotional or dramatic, can over time lead one to have a particular listening of themselves, have a particular view of themselves that has them suppress emotion and have an internal conversation that emotion is bad. Or if you grew up in a house where everyone else had very strong imposing emotion, and for you that, um, left you with a particular, experience of trauma, then the response can be the opposite, which is to suppress and say, I'm not going to be like that. So these are some of the ways where the expression of emotion can occur, like can be a trauma response. Now, the second thing is that society has basically trained us that emotions are bad, particularly in organizations, and companies in the business realm, in the corporate setting. Right, there are. I remember coming up in medical school and in residency, one of the sayings was "Leave your feelings at the door." Right. I do know that, of course, as a Black woman, when you express any type of emotion other than discontent, happiness, it's often viewed as a threat. So for us, our emotions, and for Black men as well, emotions can come as a threat, can be viewed as bad, viewed as a threat to society, which once again can lead us to try to tame or pull back, or suppress our emotions. Um, and the use of words, and this is particularly in the organizational setting, when we're told you're too emotional. Um, that in of itself has, over time, can create an internal conversation or an internal desire to suppress one's natural feeling of emotion. Now, here's the problem with that, though, because over time, especially if this type of languaging and this type of oppression and suppression begins early in one's life, early in one's developmental life, but also early in career. Like, it can begin early in one's developmental life, but it can also be something that progresses and gets reinforced. So you have this thing that can happen in the home, and then once you come outside the home, in the educational system, or we talk about, when we tell people to calm down, what does that mean? Sometimes telling a person to calm down when they're feeling emotion is sort of a, what's the word that I want to use, covert way, not so covert really, of invalidating one's emotion. When you say things like calm down or don't cry, when you're asking young people especially not to feel their emotions, it gives this background message that, well, it's bad to express these emotions, or it's bad to even feel this emotion. So the problem then becomes, when you have a conversation like that begins so early in life and is reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and so you begin to suppress and pull back on the emotions. Eventually you get disconnected from them. Right, you get disconnected, and sometimes there even is a fear of experiencing them, because of not knowing how they're going to come out. How are they going to be manifest, especially when you've been suppressing them for so long? Okay. So now you have the outside world who has told you emotion is bad and wrong and not to be expressed in certain settings. And then you have this internalized fear or suppression, fear and or suppression of emotion. And oftentimes that can eventually disconnect you from even understanding or knowing what emotions are happening. Now, see, here's the thing, being suppressing and just being disconnected or even dissociated doesn't make the experience of the emotion go away, because even a person who gets dissociated from the emotion, meaning they disconnected from the emotion, they will usually feel it and then immediately disconnect. So it doesn't prevent the emotion from happening, it just creates a maladaptive response, a response that's not super healthy, is what I mean by that. Okay. So, what we want to begin to understand is that when we begin to listen to the emotions coming up, and I'm going to share with you 4 recognitions that can shift the lens of looking at emotions. When we begin to listen through this particular lens and have these recognitions, it will make emotion, the emotion that happens, a valuable guidance tool. So let's talk about these recognitions. Okay. So the first recognition is recognizing when an emotion is present. If you have or are a person who immediately dissociates the moment an emotion comes, or is a person who immediately presses down or pushes down or pushes away or has that thought, I don't have time for this emotion, fear or sadness or anger. If you're a person who does that, then sometimes it can be difficult to even recognize that emotion is present. And sometimes there's just response and reaction, whether it's internal response or external response. So, one of the ways to begin to just recognize emotion is present is by just watching and noticing your external verbal and nonverbal reactions and listening to your bodily sensations. Those are clues that emotion is present. Okay, now that may seem very much at the primary level, and I guarantee that there are people who will listen to this podcast episode and find that of value. How do you recognize when emotion is present? Watch your reactions, listen to your internal bodily sensations, and I will tell you that there are many people who are very disconnected from their bodies. They live in their heads and they're disconnected from their bodies. So, we have to begin to, other than hunger of the stomach growling of hunger, get grounded in the body and what does the emotion itself feel like, or what is happening in your body, and that's a cue that some emotion is present. Now, the second thing is, now that you have identified, okay, something's happening, my response, my reaction may be a clue that there is an emotion present. Now, largely people are probably thinking positive, negative emotion, but this also goes with positive emotion, because there are people who will be listening to this episode who say, yeah, I got when the negative emotions are present, but what about the positive emotions? I have trouble feeling or experiencing joy or happiness, or when I feel too much happiness or joy, this happens. So I just want to put that in context. So now, second thing, now that you got, okay, there's some emotion present, be able to accurately recognize and label what emotion is actually happening. sometimes it's not the emotion that we think. So I was coaching a client some months ago, and as we were talking, uh, we had gone through an emotional release process that I do with my one-on-one clients, and we released old negative emotions that kind of get stuck in the body, and she was wanting to release that emotion, and so we had released anger, and we had released sadness, we had released fear, hurt, guilt, and shame. So we come back to the session, and she says to me, "I'm still feeling sadness," and so I go to dig a little bit more to understand, how does she know that she's feeling sadness? And so she says that what was happening is she was still crying, and so about certain things, that in certain when thinking about certain things. So I asked, well, are you actually feeling? Is it sadness that you're feeling? Is that what's activating the tears? And as it turns out, she said she recognized that it wasn't sadness, and then she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. So I pull out the trustee emotions wheel, which, if you have listened to me on stage, or if you've listened to any of these podcasts, I often pull out the emotions wheel. And I went through with her which of these emotions, and she actually labeled it love. So sometimes what we think the internal process is going on in our body is not the actual emotion that we thought it was. And so it's important to be able to accurately label the what's happening in the body as the appropriate emotion. And that when you do that, then you're able to go on to number 3, which is to recognize, what is the emotion telling you? What is the emotion telling you? Right? If it's a negative emotion, is it telling you about your experience of safety in that moment? If for example, if it's a fear, if it's a trepidation, if it's a hesitation, is it a warning for, oh, this may not be a safe space? Then how do you go about managing that? Or is it, if it's anger or frustration or an irritation, is it an indication that a boundary or a value is being violated? What is the emotion telling you? And when we're able to go through this process of recognizing something's happening in the body, or there's a reaction, nonverbal or verbal, that indicates an emotion is present, and we're able to label the emotion, maybe pull out our feelings wheel app. You can Google feelings wheel, and there are multiple ones that come up. You can download one, you can take a screenshot of it, pull it up and say, okay, what is it that I'm actually feeling? Label it. Then you can match the emotion that you're experiencing to the body sensation, recognize it for the future, and then look at, what is this emotion telling me? What is it telling me? Is it telling me that I'm safe or unsafe, or feeling unsafe? Is it telling me that what's happening is right in line with values? If it's a positive emotion, oh, this is right in line with my values, right in line with my passion. I'm moving in the right direction. Or is it saying that there's a boundary violation going on? Is it a protecting? Emotions can be a protective mechanism. What is it protecting, right? And so we want to start to ask ourselves, what is the emotion telling us? And this goes for positive emotion just as well as it goes for negative emotion. Because oftentimes people who are experiencing positive emotion may doubt that emotion, may be waiting for the other shoe to drop, maybe doubting, oh, is this real? Is this real happiness? Is this real joy? Or is this just, temporary? So we want to look at, what is the emotion telling us? And then finally, we want to check in to see if the emotional experience is appropriate for the experience itself, right? For the actual world experience itself, or is it activated by something in the past? What do I mean by that? Sometimes when you're speaking with someone and they say a certain thing, it activates a familiarity from something in the past that happened that was not safe or that was traumatic. And that even in the moment, if you're physically safe. It may activate something from the past. And so if you discover that the emotion itself is appropriate for the experience and you manage it accordingly, that's another podcast. You manage it accordingly. If you discover that maybe that emotional experience was not congruent with the actual event that happened, perhaps it was something that is activated by the past. And that is where you want to begin to look at, reach out. Maybe this is where you work with a professional, a coach, a therapist, to begin to look at, especially if you find that this is happening often. You want to look at what needs to be healed, held, or heard. What needs to be healed, held, or heard. So I think this, when we do these things and we begin to look at emotion from a different perspective, and this is experience in ourselves, then we allow space for others' emotions as well. So we have to be able to do this for ourselves, within ourselves. And when we're able to do that, then we can begin to allow and create space for others' emotion. And I think what's important is you can go through these 4 steps when you are experiencing emotion from another as well. I think this is extremely important. And one of the things, and these are elements of emotional intelligence: recognizing the emotion, labeling the emotion, and being able to regulate emotion, and then being able to communicate what's happening, right? So we didn't cover the regulation and the communication in this particular episode, although I talked about emotional regulation in the last episode. So, you'll be able to go and you'll be able to listen to that if you have not already. But these are elements of emotional intelligence, and I think that this is pivotal. Is critical in leadership. This is critical in leadership in organizations, because oftentimes when a person is having an emotional experience or an emotional expression, it's not even recognized as accurately as an accurate emotion that's actually happening. So when we can recognize that an emotion is happening in another, honor that emotion, have it be accurately labeled. And how do you accurately label emotion in another? Well, you don't. What you do is you ask, hey, I noticed something's happening. What is happening? It appears to me like, and then they'll tell you, no, that's not what it is, or yes, that's what it is. But even so, if the person is, let's say it's anger, and you say, well, that seems like your anger. Is that what's happening? It looks to me like, is that what's happening? And the person says, yes, I'm angry. Then the thing to do is to really open the conversation with what happened, not what's wrong, right? But what happened that caused you to be angry? Like, what happened? So then you can communicate and listen, right? Because part of communication, one of the most important parts of communication, often gets overlooked, is listening. And I talk about that all the time on stage as well. So then you can that's when you start to dig in. Well, what is this emotion telling you, right? So when you ask what happened, it's really a version of number 3. What is the emotion telling you? What is another person's emotion indicative of? And the only way you know that is by asking them, by having a conversation with them, rather than jumping to conclusions and invalidating, devaluing, ignoring. These are all the things that lead to more of the same. It does not create a space of psychological safety or emotional safety for anyone in the organization when these things are happening, when emotions are being ignored, suppressed, devalued, and feared. So then in conversation, it will be revealed if the emotional experience is appropriate for the experience or was activated by something in the past. And that is not for you as the person not experiencing the emotion to determine. It is not for you to tell someone they're overreacting. It is for them to discover. And how they discover that is in conversation, in communication. Okay. So when you are, we talked about how this process works with oneself, but when you are with another and you're on the other side of it, you can still activate these four recognitions. It just looks just a little bit differently. So I want you to take these things that I've shared today, and I want you to take these things that I have shared today, and I want you to activate them in your life. I want you to activate them in your life, for yourself and with others. Because again, this is a practice. I really believe we must practice it for ourselves first before we can practice it with another. Okay, so practice it for yourself, recognizing, listening to watching your responses, your nonverbal reactions, listening to your bodily experiences, bodily sensations to determine that there's an emotion present, accurately labeling the emotion, use your emotion wheel if necessary, recognizing what the emotion is telling you about the feeling of safety, about your boundaries, about whether you're moving in the right direction, about connectedness, whatever it's telling you, positive or negative. Okay. And check to see if the emotion itself is congruent with the experience or the event that's happened, or is it activated by something in the past? And again, positive or negative, because even positive emotions can be activated by some wonderful experience in the past. And it's good to know that. It's good to be able to recognize that. There may be nothing to do about that, but to recognize it, to continue to reinforce it, for you to know what that experience is so you can go and get more of it. Okay. If you're dealing with another, same thing. Recognize when the emotion is present in another. Ask, what happened? It looks like this. Is that the case? Right? So that's where you're you're having them label the emotion, right? You're having them label the emotion. Then in conversation, open the conversation to see what is that emotion telling you and telling them, and allow the conversation to evolve so that you all can know whether that emotion is congruent for the experience that happened, or is it activated by something in the past. And then take action accordingly. All right. Take compassionate action accordingly. All right. So with that said, share this with someone. Share this episode with someone, because in order to be able to create a more emotionally intelligent society, we need to have these conversations be happening in the world. We need to be creating those ripples. So share this with at least one other person. And if you want to know a little bit more about what I do, you know that I do. If you've been following me, you know that I do speak in organizations and train, and also I have the online course, Trauma Informed Communication course, Communication That Transforms. So if you want to know a bit more about what I do, if you want to invite me to speak in your organization, here's the website, mindremappingacademy.com. Or you can reach out to me directly from any one of the platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram, whatever platform you want, you can reach out to me and we can have a conversation. So until then, have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And as always, stay empowered. And I'll see you on the next one.